Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest stories that has ever been told in the dark forests. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments if you're going to be there. Let's look into a story that doesn't make sense and is still a mystery. It is not true that this movie was made. It was just made for fun. Any resemblance to real people, live or dead, is just a coincidence. In the fall of 1891, cold winds started to blow across the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, bringing not only the sign of a harsh winter, but also rumors of things that would happen in that area that would change it forever. Many people were afraid to go into the huge, dense forests, where pine trees that were hundreds of years old blocked the sun, even in the middle of the day. At that time, Michigan was still showing signs of the logging boom, and the land was scattered with small towns that seemed to be lost in a green, impenetrable ocean. It seemed like time moved more slowly in the area known as County Marquette. The only way to get from one village to another was through muddy trails cut through the trees. Messengers on horses took days to travel distances that we would cross in hours today. It was a world apart, where people in cities seemed like distant memories and wild nature ruled. Whole towns were cut off from the rest of the world for months during harsh winters, and reports of travelers who never made it to their destination were too common to be taken seriously right away. In this place, a series of events began to. Things happened that can't be explained logically. Strange reports began coming from a certain part of the forest close to what the locals called the Valley of Shadows. No one came up with the name on a whim. Even when it was very bright outside, that narrow valley, which was surrounded by steep hills covered in thick vegetation, was always shrouded in twilight. The terrain made it so that sounds were distorted, which was very disturbing. There were too many echoes to count, and it always felt like someone was watching. When experienced hunters who knew those forests like the back of their hand started coming back from trips with stories that were hard to believe, that was the first sign that something was very wrong. They talked about strange buildings that were found deep in the woods. These buildings didn't make any sense. They weren't huts or shelters. They were something else, something that looked like it had a purpose but didn't say what it was. Circles of stone set up in exact, geometric shapes. Trees with marks carved into them, orders that seem to follow a logic that we don't fully understand. What was really scary, though, wasn't the buildings themselves, but the atmosphere around them. The area was avoided by animals. Deer that normally roamed the whole area took long side trips to avoid crossing the valley. There were no birds in the trees nearby. The silence was so thick that it didn't sound natural. It was like the forest itself kept its breath. There was also something else that the hunters didn't want to say because they were afraid of being laughed at. They swore that as they got closer to those buildings, they felt like someone was watching them, like invisible eyes were watching everything they did. People in small villages talked about the news slowly in pubs and markets. At first, a lot of people thought the stories were just superstition, or the result of being alone in the forests for a long time. After hearing the same stories from different hunters who hadn't talked to each other, doubt turned into growing unease. There was something going on in the Vale of Shadows that didn't make sense. I understand. At that point, the local government decided to look into it because people were getting more and more worried. A small group was put together of men who knew the area well and were trusted by the community. In November, it was foggy when they left, and it was already cold outside. The ground was getting hard from the first frosts. They brought food for a week, camping gear, and weapons, not because they thought trouble was going to happen, but because it was the smart thing to do, going into those unfriendly forests. No one could have known that this trip would only be the start of a chain of events that would make the Valley of Shadows a name people associate with horror and mystery. No one thought what they would find inside would make them question everything they thought they knew about that land. The days that followed the expedition's departure went by painfully slowly for those who were waiting for news. Families went about their daily lives as usual, but there was a palpable sense of tension in the air. There was an air of unspoken expectation in every conversation, every look they gave each other in the muddy village streets. As fall kept moving forward, the first snowflakes started to cover the distant hills. 7 days after they left, when the group finally came back, something had changed. Not in how they looked, even though they were clearly tired and dirty from the trip, but in how their eyes showed something deeper. It was like they had seen something that words could not fully describe. They didn't say a word about what they had found for hours, until they finally got together in the small room that was the community's administrative center and started to talk about what they had seen. They said the valley was even scarier than what the first report said. The stone structures were not made by chance or by natural processes. There was purpose, clear purpose behind every arrangement. What scared people the most, though, was how big what they found. It wasn't just a few circles spread out in a field. There were dozens of them connected by trails that seemed to follow a pattern that wasn't clear at first. There were also more things left over among the stones, metal, and wood artifacts that didn't fit with anything that was known to exist in that area. One of the men, who had been on many trips through the forests of Michigan, talked about how it felt to be watched all the time. They could always feel eyes watching them no matter where they looked. What was left behind them stayed, and there were sounds. In the middle of the night, when they were camping near the valley, sounds from the darkness woke them up. The sounds weren't those of known animals, like wolves howling or bears growling. The sounds were strange, almost human, but distorted in a way that made your blood chill. What they found in one of the bigger structures, a circular formation about 10 meters in diameter, was even scarier. There were clear signs in the middle that there had been many fires there. It looked like the ashes were just a few weeks old. It was being used by someone or something in the present, not a long time ago. The discovery made the mystery seem even more important now. They weren't just dealing with relics of something long gone and forgotten. They were dealing with a real, present presence. The local government didn't know what to do with such vague and upsetting information. There was no clear crime or law that needed to be looked into. But people's growing unease meant that something had to be done. At that point, it was decided that an even deeper and more organized investigation was needed. But before they could plan something like that, something else happened that sped up the situation's development. In December 1891, when winter was already seriously setting in over Michigan, a lone traveler came into the village with scary news. He came from a nearby town that was a few miles away and said that people from and they had also started to look into the valley because of the rumors that were going around the area. There was something wrong with some of these explorers, though. They came back, but they were different. They talked about having strange visions and hearing voices in the forest making threats and promises. For some, what started as interest quickly turned into an obsession. Reports said that people kept coming back to the valley, as if they couldn't stay away. Each time they came back, they were different. As they got farther away and more upset, some of them started speaking languages that no one understood and drawing complicated pictures that matched patterns in the stone structures. Things were getting worse in ways that no one could have seen coming. What began as a small mystery was growing into something bigger, something that seemed to have a deep and scary effect on people who got too close. And winter, with its constant cold that can cut off whole communities, was just getting started. The long nights that were coming would bring new problems and secrets that would make the mystery of the Veil of Shadows even more complex. Things are about to happen that will test how much those isolated communities can understand and handle. There were secrets in the valley that went back to long ago, and those secrets are about to come out in strange and very scary ways. Few people in the area could remember a winter as harsh as the one that hit in 1892. The snow kept falling and building up in hills that went up to the roofs of the cabins at the very bottom. There was a lot of wind in the forests, and the oldest trees were shaking like they were going to fall over any second. When people were forced to stay away from each other, when roads stopped working and communities were shut down, things around the Valley of Shadows took an even scarier turn. During the long winter nights, the stories spread from person to person in a way that seemed natural. Around crackling fireplaces, where families huddled together for warmth and company, new details and layers of strangeness were added to the stories of the valley. Some of these stories came from people who were thought to be trustworthy because they were known for being sober and sensible. This made it even harder to dismiss them as fantasy or exaggeration. A merchant who had spent decades going back and forth between the villages in the area had a very interesting point of view. He known the old stories that the people who lived there before Europeans came to settle there told them. According to these old stories, the Valley of Shadows has always been a dangerous place because of strange events that go back many generations. Rituals were said to have been done there in the past, when it was used as a meeting place for reasons that are lost to time. What was both interesting and scary was how similar the stories from the past and the present were. Things that happen. Interestingly, the descriptions of the stone structures that were found matched up very well with parts of traditional stories. The designs carved into the trees looked like patterns found on some ancient artifacts that are found in the area. It seemed like something very old was coming back to life after being dormant for an unknown amount of time. But something new was going on as well, something that didn't happen in the old stories. The valley seemed to have a lot of. Exert on those who visited it was getting stronger. Visiting the area made people who used to be strong members of the community and known for being reasonable and balanced change how they act. There were no big or sudden changes. Instead, there were small ones that happened over time, like their minds were slowly changing. One of the most interesting cases involved a cartographer who had been hired months before to make maps of the forest's less visited areas. He was a careful, organized man his reputation was built on how meticulously he did his work. He spent a few weeks exploring the area around the Valley of Shadows and making notes on the geography and features of the area. When he came back, he had maps that didn't make sense at all. The drawings were technically perfect, and were done with the level of skill that would be expected from someone with his experience. But what they showed didn't make sense. Some of the structures shown could not exist. Geological features that didn't follow the basic rules of physics, rivers that flowed in. There were impossible circles and hills that looked like they were in more than one dimension at the same time. When asked about these problems, the cryptographer insisted that his maps were correct and showed what he had seen. There was something in his eyes, a strong sense of certainty, mixed with a deep sense of unease that made it impossible to just write him off as crazy. This happened again and again with other people who came to the valley. Every one of them brought back something different, a new way of seeing the world. Looked at. One naturalist talked about species of plants that shouldn't be able to survive in that climate, but he couldn't put them into any known taxonomic category. A geologist talked about rock formations that didn't seem to fit with the accepted order of events, as if different geological eras were living together at the same time in that small area. As winter went on and more reports came out, a scary picture began to take shape. There was nothing remotely strange about the Vale of Shadows. It looked like the normal rules of reality didn't apply there, as if some kind of threshold was being crossed slowly but surely. This trait was becoming more noticeable in subtle but deep ways. Local governments were already having a hard time keeping communities running during the harsh winter, and now they were in completely new territory. There was no example, guide, or set of rules for how to handle this kind of situation. The only tools that were available were close observation and careful writing down of every new development in the hopes that a pattern would start to show up, and a logical explanation would become clear. It was decided that as soon as spring came around and travel became safer, a bigger, better equipped, and better prepared expedition would be put together. This one would have a different goal than the others, though. It wouldn't just be exploratory, it would be truly investigative. Not only would they try to map and record the valley, but they would also try to figure out what was going on at its core. That's it. During the winter months, when everyone was alone, there were some people who couldn't stop thinking about the valley, even when common sense told them to be careful. Some people took dangerous trips through deep snow to go back to that place. It was like an unstoppable force pulled them back, and every time they did, they brought new pieces to a puzzle that seemed to keep growing, getting more complicated and confusing with each new piece. Lots of people talked about during the long winter nights what all of this means. Theories were put forward and then thrown out, and explanations were tested and found to be inadequate. Throughout it all, they had a growing sense that they were dealing with something they couldn't fully understand, something that might be better left unexplored. But because people are naturally curious and want to know and understand things, they couldn't just ignore the mystery that was beating in the middle of that dark forest. It rained all winter, but spring finally came through with a violent storm. The Thor turned calm streams into raging torrents, and snow that had been accumulating for months melted in just a few weeks, revealing a landscape that had been changed. The forests in Michigan woke up from their winter sleep with a fierce energy, as if nature itself wanted to make up for the months of cold silence. It was during this time of renewal that the promised expedition finally came together. This time, the group was bigger, and it was made up of people who had been carefully chosen not only not for their physical stamina, but for the skills they have. One person studied strange natural events and had spent years trying to figure out how geography and the environment could cause strange illusions and effects on perception. He was with someone who knew a lot about old buildings and the different ways that different cultures have built things over the years. Going to the Valley of Shadows took 3 full days. The spring rains made the trails dangerous and slippery, people who had never been to the area before could feel something changing in the air as they got closer. There was a subtle change in the air quality, the way sounds traveled, and the light coming through the trees. It wasn't easy to describe. When they got to the valley, they saw something that was even more amazing than what they had heard beforehand. The stone buildings covered a lot more ground than previous reports said, and some of them were partially hidden by. Plants grow in random patterns, as if they are trying to avoid certain spots. What was most impressive was how perfectly the shapes were put together. There was no way to go wrong. Each stone fit exactly where it was supposed to in the bigger pattern. The expert on old buildings looked at the formations for hours, carefully measuring and writing down every detail that could be seen. His conclusions were both interesting and scary at the same time. No known method of construction could have been used for this project. The native cultures of the area nor to the ways of life of the Europeans who came and settled there. There was a level of sophistication that suggested advanced mathematical knowledge, including an understanding of angles and proportions that didn't seem to fit with the time and place in question. The symbols cut into the trees around the structures were even more interesting. They weren't writing in the usual sense. Instead, they looked like some kind of notation or marking system that had clear rules for how it should be used. The expert on natural events came up with an interesting theory. It's possible that those symbols weren't meant to help people talk to each other. Instead, they were meant to be signs of something deeper, of certain things about that place that the people who made them thought were important to remember. The expedition did a number of simple but informative experiments while they were camped in the valley. They noticed that sound behaved in strange ways, with echoes coming from odd places and voices being carried over long distances, more than what normal sound waves would allow. They noticed that the temperature changed in strange ways. Some places stayed cold even in the direct afternoon sun, while other places stayed strangely warm even at night. Additionally, there were times when everyone felt lost. It became surprisingly hard to walk in a straight line, and it was simple to get lost, even when landmarks were easy to see. Some members of the group said they had a strange dizziness, as if they were. They could feel that the ground beneath them wasn't completely solid. These experiences were scary because they were so subtle. They were never too big of a deal to be clearly abnormal, but they happened so often that they were impossible to ignore. Something very strange happened on the third night that they camped in the valley. The sky was very clear, with no clouds, and the crescent moon gave off enough light for the stone structures to make sharp shadows on the forest floor. At that point, one of the expedition members saw something that everyone else had missed in some way. The shadows were not acting right. They were moving without the light that was supposed to make them, getting longer and shorter in ways that didn't match where the moon was in the sky. This observation led to a number of new investigations. As they started to systematically watch how light interacted with that environment, they found patterns of strange events. There were times when reflections showed up where they shouldn't have, surfaces, when it looked like light was bending around things instead of hitting them. It looked like the basic optical laws were just suggestions that were being followed in a random way. The scientist who studies natural events came up with a complicated theory. It's possible that the specific mix of geological factors, the minerals found in the rocks, and the way the land is shaped created conditions that deeply changed how people see things. What they were going through might not have been supernatural, but it seemed pretty natural in a way that didn't make sense. The valley might be a rare geological oddity, a place where unusual conditions came together to make amazing things happen. Even though it tried to make sense, this explanation couldn't explain everything. That didn't explain the constant sense of presence, the feeling that someone or something was watching them all the time. This didn't explain the vivid and scary dreams that everyone on the expedition had while they were there that night. Dreams that often had things in common even though they hadn't talked about them together. When the expedition finally got back to civilization, they brought a lot of paperwork with them, including detailed drawings, exact measurements, and careful notes. They brought more questions than answers, though, and it became clear that the Valley of Shadows held a secret that could not be fully solved with the tools and knowledge that were available. Ready to go. The people who lived near the Valley of Shadows had a very different view of the mystery in the months after the expedition returned. What people used to be afraid of out of superstition and cautiously interested in had changed into something more complicated, an almost academic interest that drew people from farther and farther away. The news of the discoveries had spread in strange ways, crossing county and state lines and getting to people who were interested in. Unusual events were more important than any worries about possible dangers. During the summer of 1892, a lot of people came to the valley. Some people came because they were genuinely interested in the reported strange things and wanted to learn more about them through scientific methods and careful observation. Others were more irrational. They were looking for something in that mysterious place that their everyday lives didn't give them, a way to transcend or connect with forces they thought operated beyond the everyday. The truth. There were also people who couldn't say no people who had been to the valley once and couldn't stay away for long. A regular visitor was one of these people who would become very important to what would happen. Her background was unknown, and she had just moved to the area with no history to speak of. She only said that she studied patterns in nature. She had an amazing knack for seeing connections that other people missed and finding hidden regularities in what seems to be chaos. Many people started to think of her as an unofficial guardian of the valley because she was there all the time. She was the first person to say that the stone structures weren't spread out randomly, but instead followed a clear pattern that was connected to features of the land that could not be seen. She walked among the formations for days on end, taking notes in notebooks that quickly became full of complicated diagrams and in-depth observations. Her ideas were both interesting and hard to understand. To check, which made it seem like the valley was some kind of convergence point, a spot where invisible lines of natural force met in unique ways. When other scholars visited the site, they started to work with her by comparing their own observations and finding surprising links between them. One of these collaborators was a man who had spent his whole life studying the magnetism of the Earth and how it changes over time. He brought sensitive tools with him that let him measure magnetic fields. He was very accurate, and his readings in the valley showed clear problems. At times, the compass wouldn't point in any direction at all, slowly turning as if it were lost, and at other times the magnetic field was several times stronger than it should have been. These results were the start of a bigger theory that explained more. There may have been a big geomagnetic event in the Valley of Shadows, and this trait affected not only measuring tools, but also people. How the body works in subtle ways. It was known that magnetic fields can affect the brain, and that long-term exposure to unusual variations could possibly change how people think, feel, and even perceive things. This would explain the changes in behavior seen in people who come here a lot, their feelings of being lost, and maybe even the vivid dreams they shared. But the picture got more complicated as they looked into it. The strange magnetic events were only a part of the puzzle. There were also strange changes in the soil. Composition, mineral concentrations that didn't make sense from a geological point of view, and stratifications that pointed to formation processes that didn't fit with what was known about the area's history. A visiting geologist spent weeks taking samples and doing basic tests on the site. After doing this, he came to the conclusion that the valley's geological history was very different from that of the surrounding areas, as if it had formed through very different processes or at a very different time. There were also interesting things about the plants. In the valley, some types of plants grew in huge numbers, while others were not at all present. Some trees had strange growth patterns, with trunks that bent at weird angles before going back to growing straight up. Branches that grew together to make geometric patterns that were almost symmetrical. A botanist who spent a whole month writing down information about the local plants said that the soil and other unique environmental factors created a microclimate that encouraged adaptations that were not common. As summer went on, and as more data was gathered, a picture of a completely unique ecosystem began to take shape. This was an area where a number of strange factors came together to create conditions that had never been seen anywhere else. It wasn't just interesting from a scientific point of view that this thing was different. It affected people who spent a lot of time in the valley right away, and in real ways. The changes in mental health were the most well-known and worrisome. People who had been in the valley for a long time started to report changes in how they think about time. It felt like hours went by in a flash, or that minutes went on for what felt like forever. This distortion of time could not be measured by clocks, but it happened so often that it could not be explained away as a subjective feeling. Some visitors felt like they had a strong emotional connection with the valley and found it hard to leave, as if leaving the valley meant giving up something important to them. There were also people who developed abilities they didn't expect. While in the valley, one visitor found that he could accurately predict how the weather would change. However, this ability went away as soon as he got back to civilization. Another person said he could find groundwater incredibly accurately, as if he could feel it in the ground. These abilities were always temporary and only worked when the person was physically in that place. This suggests that the environment was either activating latent abilities or letting them out in a normal way, inaccessible ways of perceiving. It was the woman who had become the valley's most dedicated scholar, who suggested that all of these things were linked and formed a logical system that could be understood. She started to come up with a complicated theory that the valley was a unique kind of confluence, a place where many natural forces met and made each other's effects stronger. Her theory said there was no need to bring up anything supernatural to describe what was taking place. Nature alone, working in conditions that were strange enough, could cause effects that would seem magical to people who don't understand them well enough. But not everyone agreed with this view, which was based only on nature. Some voices insisted that there was something else going on, and that the strange things that were being seen were signs of something deeper and more fundamentally different. These people said that the trees' consistent use of symbols, the geometric, the accuracy of the stone structures and the clear intention behind their arrangement all pointed to a conscious purpose and careful planning. If there was purpose, then there was intelligence behind it, which may still be present in some form. At night, when groups of scholars and curious onlookers gathered in makeshift camps on the edge of the valley, the arguments got heated. Theories were put forward and argued against for hours, and evidence was interpreted and reinterpreted. The valley stayed quiet throughout it all, keeping its secret safe by giving hints but never clear answers, allowing interpretation but refusing to come to a final conclusion. As the leaves turned red and gold in the fall, it became clear that the mystery of the Valley of Shadows would not be easy to solve, and might never be solved at all. What they found proved that this place was truly amazing, and it also showed how deeply complicated the mystery they were trying to solve was. And people became more aware that maybe some questions weren't meant to have answers, that some mysteries should stay open, just a little bit mysterious to show how little we know. There were changes in the air in the valley that no one could properly explain when autumn came. It looked like the trees around the stone structures changed color in a way that wasn't typical for that species. They took on colors that didn't match the rest of the forest. A few branches stayed. Some trees still had green leaves, but others had deep red and bright gold leaves, making a visual mosaic that didn't follow the normal patterns of the seasons. It looked like each tree was following its own internal clock and wasn't connected to the natural cycles that controlled the rest of the world. At this point in time, the woman who had been studying the valley in great detail made a discovery that would completely change the direction of the investigations, while looking at the marks on one of. She saw that the symbols were not fixed like everyone had thought in the oldest trees. There were small clues that more carvings were being added, like new marks covering up old ones. Someone or something was always changing those patterns and making them more up-to-date based on unknown criteria. This information led to more systematic surveillance. Small groups started to stay up all night and watch the areas with the most markings, hoping to see who or what was making these changes. The protests were. The experiences were very intense, and the tension grew as the hours went by in the dark. At night, the valley was completely and eerily quiet. Only sounds that seemed to come from nowhere, like echoes that couldn't be traced back to a source, broke the silence. On one of these vigils, which took place on a very dark October night, they finally saw something. Many people thought it would be scary or dramatic, but it wasn't. Instead, the subtle strangeness of it was deeply unsettling. Shadows moved through the trees in ways that had nothing to do with any light that could be seen. They weren't shadows of people or animals. They were shapes that didn't seem to have any substance and seemed to soak up light instead of just blocking it. The people watching stayed still, nervous and interested. As these shapes moved through the valley, they seemed to gather around certain stone structures and stay there for different amounts of time before disappearing back into the darkness. There was no sound associated with their movements, no physical sign of their passage other than the fact that they could be seen. And when the first light of dawn came up, they were no longer visible. It was like they had never been that way. People who saw what happened were very confused afterward. What they had seen couldn't be easily explained. There were too many people seeing the same things at the same time for it to have been collective hallucinations. It wasn't. Trickery, since the observations were made with lighting that was carefully controlled. There was only one thing left to do, except that something truly strange had happened, something that didn't fit into any known category of natural event. In the weeks that followed, other groups held their own night vigils, and many of them said they had similar experiences. The shadowy shapes were seen as part of the mystery of the valley, another piece of a puzzle that was getting harder and harder to put together. Some thought they might have been a special kind of weather event, possibly connected to the magnetic anomalies in the area. Others came up with more strange explanations, like the idea that they were seeing natural energies manifest in ways that modern science had not yet found or understood. The most well-known scholar in the valley came up with her own theory, which was both bold and based on careful observations of the real world. She said that the valley was like a natural lens, a place where certain conditions could happen, allowed people to see parts of reality that they normally couldn't. Her model said that what they called shadowy forms might be pictures of energy fields that were everywhere but could only be seen by humans in the valley because of the way it was set up. People who liked to look for natural explanations liked this theory, but a lot of people didn't believe it. Many people didn't agree with it because it didn't explain why the movements of the forms, the fact that they seemed to gather on purpose in certain places. If they were just natural events, why did they act in a way that looked like it was planned? While these arguments went on, the valley continued to have its own strange effect on everyone who came near. The changes in the minds of frequent visitors got stronger and more varied. Some people became more sensitive to small changes in their environment and were able to predict when the weather would change or identify. Being with other people at impossible distances. Others noticed changes in their sleep patterns. They found that they needed less rest when they were in the valley, as if the air itself was energizing them. There were also people who started to feel what they could only describe as clearer thinking. When you're in the valley, problems that seemed impossible to solve from the outside suddenly became clear. It was very clear how different ideas were connected to each other. It was like thoughts were flowing more freely, not being slowed down by the normal rules that controlled how our minds worked. Many smart people started going to the valley on purpose to think and reflect, bringing their toughest problems with them in the hopes that the unique atmosphere would help them find answers. However, these good experiences were balanced out by some that were not as helpful. Some people became emotionally dependent on the valley and became antsy and angry when they have to be away from it for too long. The world outside the valley seemed dull, less real, and less vivid to these people. Because people had such different experiences, it was hard to agree on what the place was really like. Was it good or bad for you? A resource to be used or a threat to be kept in check? As local governments watched these events with growing worry, they started to think about taking more direct actions. There were plans to limit who could get into the valley to, set limits on how long people could stay, and make sure that frequent visitors are supervised by a doctor. But putting these kinds of measures into action was hard because of philosophical and practical problems. What was the right reason to put limits on a place that, as far as they knew, hadn't hurt anyone directly? How to protect the public while also letting people explore freely? As fall came to an end and Michigan's forests were hit by the first icy winter winds, It was clear that the Valley of Shadows was no longer just a creepy place in the area. It had changed into something that was hard to put into a single category. It was now a place that operated by its own rules and didn't care about people trying to understand or control it. People who took part in it had to think about basic questions about what reality is, how much we can know, and what it means to really understand the world around us. Michigan experienced a winter that was as harsh as any in recorded history, the one before. But this time, the people who lived near the Valley of Shadows knew they would be alone during the winter in a different way. The mystery they had been looking into for months was no longer a strange new thing that scared them. It was now a constant part of their lives and was a part of how they lived every day. People didn't talk about whether the valley was unusual anymore during the long winter nights. Instead, they talked about what to do with this unusualness. The scholar, who had spent a lot of time in the valley, made a choice that no one expected. During the harsh winter, she didn't go to the villages to find shelter. Instead, she stayed near the valley and built a simple cabin a good distance from the stone buildings. She did this because she thought that the patterns she saw during the warmer months might change as the seasons did, and she didn't want to miss the chance to record these changes. Some people thought she was careless, while others admired how hard she worked. But no matter what people thought, her continued presence at the site would give them information that no one else could. During those months of being alone, she carefully recorded what she saw in diaries. Even stranger things could be seen in the valley below the snow. The snow did not fall in a uniform way. In some places, it didn't change for weeks and formed big mounds. In other places, especially near some stone structures, it melted almost as fast as it fell, even when it was raining. The temperature stayed below freezing the whole time. There wasn't a clear reason for these differences. The difference couldn't be explained by places getting more or less sun, or areas being protected from the wind. People had seen shadowy shapes in the fall, and they kept showing up, but more often and with more force during the winter. When it was really dark, when the moon wasn't visible and only the stars were shining, they seemed brighter, solid and almost tangible. The researcher watched them for hours and hours, looking for patterns in their movements to try to figure out what might be driving or guiding their behavior, which seemed to be on purpose. She noticed that the shapes seemed to change depending on the weather. They were more active during snowstorms, when the wind howled through the trees and visibility was almost non-existent. They moved more quickly during these times, in contrast to how slowly they moved during other times. Nights are quiet. During the aurora borealis, which can sometimes be seen at that latitude, the shapes took on a glow-like quality, as if they took in and let out the sky's dancing light at slightly different frequencies. In her notes, she also wrote down changes in how she thought and felt. She had trouble describing the effects of being alone for a long time in such a strange place. There were times when she felt incredibly clear and knew the deepest connections between, as she watched different things happen, but when she tried to describe them in words, her ideas disappeared like fog. There were also times when people felt like they were going through time more strongly than short-term visitors, like when days seemed to go by in hours and nights seemed to last forever. When spring finally came, and the paths could be used again, the first people who went to the scholar's cabin found her changed, but not in a physical way. Because of how she spoke and thought, her health seemed surprisingly good considering how long she had been alone. She had created a way of talking that included ideas that were hard to translate. These ideas made sense in the valley, but they didn't make sense when translated into everyday language outside of the valley. People read her winter diaries over and over again. There were detailed observations on the pages, as well as diagrams that got more complicated and tried to map. There are connections between the different things that happen in the valley. The shadowy shapes were drawn in different stages of being there. notes on how their appearances were linked to changes in the moon phases, the weather, and even the Earth's magnetic field, which she had learned by carefully watching them with compasses and other sensitive tools. Other scholars were most interested in a set of entries that seemed to show that the scholar had started to communicate with the shadowy forms in some way. It wasn't communication in the usual sense of the word. Instead, there was an exchange of patterns and responses to behaviors. She talked about how certain things she did seemed to make the forms react in certain ways, as if a basic set of rules for how to interact were being slowly set up. People were very skeptical of this claim, but it was hard to ignore how consistent her observations were. The next spring and summer, there was a lot of interest in the valley again, but this time with a different goal. More and more people wanted to do more than just record and think about things. They wanted to experiment and test their hypotheses in more active ways. Groups started to try to repeat what the scholars had seen and figure out how to interact with the shadowy figures on their own. Things didn't go as planned, which was frustrating. Some said they had had similar experiences to hers. Others didn't see anything other than what was already known about the environment. Because of this and other experiences, a new line of inquiry was led. Maybe the valley didn't leave the same mark on everyone. There might have been something about the way each person saw or felt about that place that affected how much and what kind of interaction they had with it. According to this theory, the valley wasn't really a thing that happened. It was more like a place where certain environmental features and human abilities met. To test this hypothesis, simple experiments were done. A mix of people from different places, people with different personalities and histories of being in the valley, were put through similar conditions over and over again, and their experiences were carefully recorded and compared. Based on the results, it looked like there were significant correlations. People with certain psychological traits or ways of processing sensory information were more likely to experience the strangest things about the valley. But these discoveries didn't answer all of our questions. When the valley worked as a kind of amplifier of latent capabilities, what did this mean for our understanding of consciousness? What did the fact that different people could literally see different realities in the same space mean about the nature of reality itself? It was hard to separate speculation from real-world observations because these philosophical questions were tied to real-world investigations. It became clear that the Valley of Shadows was real as the year went on and the leaves began to change color again, marking the start of another fall season. It was no longer just a mystery that needed to be solved. It had turned into a mirror that showed people their own limits and opportunities, a place that made us question not only what we knew about science, but also the categories we used to try to understand the world. In the fall, something unexpected happened that would change the course of everything that had happened up to that point in a big way. Someone came to the valley from a faraway place, a man who had spent his whole life studying places that other people thought were strange or different cultures around the world hold them in high regard. He had a very different point of view because he had spent decades seeing things that couldn't be explained by normal means. The way he arrived was different from the way the scholars who had been studying the valley had been doing things. Others tried to figure it out by taking detailed measurements and analyses, but he just sat next to the stone structures and took in the atmosphere for hours without saying a word, trying to put it into a category or explain it right away. When he finally started to talk about what he had seen and felt, his words had the weight of years of experience. According to him, the valley wasn't the only one in the world. It was part of a larger group of places that were on the edge between normal and strange. He said there were other places on Earth with similar conditions and effects that were similar. Even though each was unique in its own way, in their many forms, these places were anchor points for something that went beyond geography. They were like windows through which normally hidden parts of reality could be seen for a moment. At first, scholars who were more interested in science didn't agree with this point of view. They saw it as a return to mystical ways of thinking that they thought were out of date. But the visitor wasn't suggesting giving up reason, which is what some people think of as mysticism. As an alternative, he said that logic should expand to include things that didn't fit well into the categories that were already in place. He said that real wisdom meant being aware of the limits of what we know now, without assuming that these limits also meant the limits of what we could know. He spent weeks in the valley, making his own observations in a way that seemed more reflective than analytical. During this time, something very interesting took place. People had been very interested in and guessing about the shadowy shapes that started to show up, themselves in clearer ways when he was around. He didn't think he saw them better than other people. Instead, they seemed to respond to him more naturally, as if they saw something familiar or important in the way he was talking to them. Observers who went with him wrote down conversations that showed a higher level of communication than the scholar had reached during her winter alone. The shapes moved in ways that looked like they were responding directly to what the visitors did, getting closer to them. They got closer when he moved, and farther away when he stood still, making patterns around him that seemed planned and important. It was like watching a dance between people who spoke a complicated language with their bodies. When asked how he had built this relationship, the visitor said it wasn't a specific method, but rather a way of thinking. Rather than seeing the valley and its strange events as problems that needed to be solved, he saw them as presences that needed to be respected. He didn't want to rule or control, but rather get along with others. Understand the place's rules, not just his own. He said that this shift in point of view was essential to really understanding places like that. People who had been through the most difficult parts of the valley related to his ideas the most. People who thought that by trying to explain and measure everything in a mechanical way, something important was being lost. A thin line started to appear between two approaches that were not necessarily at odds with each other but were definitely different in their ideas and ways of doing things. There were people who kept looking for strict naturalistic explanations, and people who embraced a more holistic view that allowed mystery to be a part of the experience. All through this time, the stone structures seemed to show new sides. With the visitors' help, people started to notice that the stone arrangements were not as stable as they thought. Over time, small changes happened that weren't so big that they were obvious, but they were there, present when comparing pictures taken at different times of the year. Some stones moved a little, others showed up where none had been before, and sometimes some just vanished without a trace of how or why. These observations made me think about agency and intention in very confusing ways. There was something or someone changing the structures if they were changing. But what or who? The shadowy shapes looked like they could be stones, but no one had seen one of them move. There was also the chance that as yet understood natural processes were at work, as well as forces that changed matter in ways that modern physics either didn't see or couldn't explain. Many people found the visitor's explanation both interesting and hard to believe. He said that the valley might be a place where it's hard to tell who is observing and who is being observed, and where people's attention not only records events, but also takes part in making them happen. This point of view says that the changes in the stone structures could be partly because the investigator was there, their hopes and plans affecting what happened in a subtle way. Some people who believed in scientific objectivity were very upset by this idea, but it hit home for many people who had lived in the valley, feeling that the place changed slightly depending on who was there and how they approached it whenever people were there. If this were true, then studying the valley wasn't just looking at it. It was a part of it, a difficult conversation in which both sides had an effect on the other. As the fall went on and the conversations got more in-depth, a new understanding began to form. Maybe the question wasn't about picking between scientific explanation and embracing mystery, or between using logic and letting go of what words can't say. Maybe the wisest thing to do was to keep both points of view at the same time and realize that the valley worked on different levels of reality that needed different ways of understanding to be fully grasped. The visitor finally left in the same quiet and unceremonious way he had come, but his influence lingered. He made people think about things they hadn't thought about before. He said that learning to live with questions that might not have clear answers was more important than finding a single clear explanation for what happened in the Valley of Shadows. And maybe the way he talked about it made it seem like accepting mystery wasn't intellectual defeat, but a more profound kind of knowing. Over the next few years, the communities around the Veil of Shadows slowly but surely changed how they understood and lived with it. What started out as a scary mystery turned into something more complicated, a presence that affected everyday life in ways that no one could have imagined. People got used to living in a place that wasn't clear-cut. They developed a kind of practical wisdom that saw both the place's possible dangers and its amazing opportunities. The wise man. The person who had spent that winter alone near the valley became a kind of unofficial guardian that people talked to before they went on long trips. She knew intuitively how the valley worked, what conditions made it easier or harder to get to, and what habits helped people get around in its strange features without getting lost. In the traditional scientific sense, her knowledge wasn't organized, but it was very useful and surprisingly good at what it did. A type of culture began to form over time. Get out of the valley. There were informal habits that regular visitors picked up, not because they were superstitious, but because they worked. Coming up to the valley at dawn or dusk, when the light and dark were changing, seemed to make experiences more coherent. Spending some time sitting in silence at first to let your senses get used to the strange atmosphere of the place helped you feel less lost. Visitors passed these practices on to each other, creating a body of knowledge, gathered from a huge number of individual experiences. Over the years, the stone structures slowly changed. Their patterns changed in ways that made me think of some kind of natural process, as if they were less fixed monuments and more living things that were always changing. Some circles went away completely, their stones breaking up or just going away, and new arrangements appeared where there were none before. It took the scholar a long time to notice a pattern in all of these changes. Come out. A cycle that seemed to match not only the seasons but also longer cycles that went on for years. The dark shapes became a normal part of life in the valley. Their presence is no longer setting off the alarm it did at first. People who went there often got to know them and learned to read their movements and behaviors as signs of certain conditions in the place. Some parts of the valley became more strange and experienced more unusual things when the shapes were active. Visitors knew they should stay away out of courtesy. When they didn't show up or were quiet, the valley felt more peaceful, but it was never completely normal. Over the years, people have tried to make more permanent records of the valley. Some artists went there to paint or draw pictures of the place, but they couldn't get a good representation of it. The pictures they took were never quite right. They lacked the important thing that made the valley unique: what it was. The writers tried to put their experiences into words in a professional way, but the words keep going around the issue's core without ever really getting to it. It seemed like the valley had a basic quality that wouldn't let anyone describe it, and could only be understood by experiencing it for oneself. During this time, the communities around the valley built a practical relationship with it. It wasn't seen as a threat or just something interesting anymore. It was seen as a strange resource. People came from long distances to get the mental clarity that the valley sometimes offered. They hoped that these times of heightened perception would help them solve long-standing problems or gain new insights into issues that were bothering them. It didn't always work, but enough of the time that it kept people interested. Some people also went to the valley for reasons that were more personal and hard to explain. In the valley, people who were going through tough times in their lives, like big losses or changes, found a place to, could think about what they had done in ways that didn't seem possible in normal settings. The strange atmosphere of the place, the way it seemed to exist a little outside of normal time and reality, made it a kind of temporary sanctuary where people could change their minds and come up with new ideas. But the valley was also dangerous. Someone, or some people, sometimes spent too much time there and had trouble getting back into normal life. For these people, after being in the valley for a long time, the normal world seemed less important, and it was hard for them to find meaning or purpose in everyday things. The scholar and other unofficial guardians learned to spot warning signs and step in when needed to help people keep a healthy balance between their lives in the valley and their lives outside of it. Over the years, stories about the valley got around, drawing attention from more and more people. But an interesting thing happened to these stories as they went far from where they came from. As they changed, they added dramatic or shocking elements that didn't fit with the place's more subtle reality. In earlier versions of its history, the valley was simplified and made less interesting than it really was. It was reduced to common ideas of haunted places or magical portals. People who really knew the valley could tell that these sped-up versions were missing the point, what the place really means. Not in strange events or supernatural revelations, but in something more subtle and deep. It was how the valley made people question what they thought they knew, to see how little they understood, and to stay open to possibilities that were hard to label or explain. It was a place that taught humility not through direct lessons, but through the direct experience of meeting something truly different, something that worked in ways that challenged some basic assumptions. The valley stayed the same through the years and seasons, a strangely quiet place in the Michigan landscape that continued to have an odd effect on anyone who came there with an open mind and heart. It didn't give any clear answers or firm conclusions. Maybe that was the most important thing about it, though. Its most valuable gift to people who are ready to meet it on their own terms. As the years went by, time kept moving forward, and the valley of shadows stayed the same as it always had, a mysterious place hidden deep in the forests of Michigan. The stone structures went through a mysterious cycle of change. They moved at speeds that didn't make sense in human time and rearranged themselves in ways that were always out of reach. The shadowy figures kept dancing among the trees at night. These appearances became both familiar and hard to explain. The scholar, who had worked there for so many years, she still walked among the stone circles, as if she were performing a holy ritual, even though her hair was silver and her eyes were heavy from all the thoughts she had been having. She had become as much a part of the landscape as the old trees. She was always there, watching the valley change slowly over the years and seasons. When young people came to try to figure out what was going on, she was patient with them and didn't give them answers. Instead, she shared perspectives that had been formed over decades of silence. An observation. His cabin near the valley had become a casual meeting spot for people who were really interested in learning more about that area. Around his fireplace, on cold nights, when the wind whispered through the trees outside, people talked about their different experiences and tried to piece them together into something that sounded like a collective understanding. However, the valley stayed the same even after many years, and with many smart people working on the problem. Its basic nature untouched, hidden behind layers that wouldn't come off all the way. During the winter of 1902, a very bad snowstorm cut off the area for weeks. When the trails were finally repairable, and the first visitors were able to get to the valley, they saw that great changes had happened. A few of the bigger stone structures had moved around so much that they made new patterns that no one had seen before. It seemed like the valley took care of. It preferred to make changes during times of total isolation, so that the changes would stay private and not be seen by others. These discoveries led to new conversations about what the valley is like. Some people said the changes were caused by natural geological processes, like freeze-thaw cycles that changed the soil and caused rocks to move. Others said that the rearrangements were done on purpose, and that the patterns followed a logic that suggested a conscious goal. Also, there were people who had come to believe that maybe both points of view were true at the same time, that the valley worked at a level where the differences between natural and intentional stopped making sense. The scholar would just smile in a mysterious way when asked about these changes. She knew a long time ago that the valley wouldn't show itself through debate or analysis, but through being patient and open to what was happening. The changes were just another part of its basic nature, another way that its basic quality showed itself, of being something on the edges, something that wouldn't fit neatly into a category. During those years, the valley continued to have a strange effect on people who came close to it. Thoughts of being mentally clearer and feelings of being lost in time were still common. People who had been to the valley still said they had very vivid dreams. Dreams often gave them unexpected insights into the problems they were having, and the shadowy figures kept showing up at night. Accepted as a normal part of the place's experience, no longer making people nervous like they did at first. The way the valley looked and felt was like it had been there forever. The world beyond the forests changed quickly as new inventions changed everyday life and old beliefs were constantly tested. But the valley didn't change much. It was like it was in a pocket outside of time, working on its own rhythms that didn't match up with the faster pulse of progress moving across the country. It became appealing because of this trait. As times changed faster and faster, the valley offered something unique. It was a place where time still moved differently, and people could slow down and live in ways that were quickly becoming lost in the outside world. People came not only to study its strange features, but also to get away from the fast-paced modern world for a while and rediscover slower, more reflective rhythms. The researchers saw these changing reasons with a quiet interest. The valley was not only being studied, but it was also becoming a special kind of sanctuary. She thought that maybe that had always been one of its purposes. Maybe purpose was too strong of a word. Maybe it was just something that the valley let people do, something they found useful about it. Over the years, the people who lived near the valley had learned useful things about how to deal with it. It was understood that there were limits that should not be crossed, and that respect should be shown. That needs to be kept up. These weren't formal rules. They were shared understandings that came from everyone's experiences. These understandings were passed down from generation to generation and became, deeply and subtly, part of the culture of the area. People sometimes tried to explore the valley in more intrusive ways, like by digging or putting up permanent monitoring gear. But these attempts always failed in ways that no one could explain. The equipment was always breaking down. Findings from excavations. Either the ground was incredibly hard for no reason, or underground springs flooded the area out of the blue. The valley seemed to actively reject certain kinds of intervention, allowing polite observation but not hostile invasion. During all those decades, the scholar kept diaries, volume after volume full of detailed observations, philosophical thoughts, sketches, and diagrams. They lived a life devoted to a single mystery. Their journey began with a search for answers but turned into something else, deeper, a kind of connection that went beyond the need for a clear explanation. People who came after her used her writings as useful guides, because they mapped the terrain of experience, showing how to get around the unique features of the valley without getting completely lost in them, not because they gave answers. As the years and seasons went by, the valley kept its secrets while generously giving glimpses of them. It encouraged exploration while resisting it. B. Dominating. It taught people about the limits of their knowledge, the value of mystery, and how important it is to understand that we can't or shouldn't fully understand everything in the world. And maybe that was its greatest gift, not the strange things it did, but the sense of humility and openness it encouraged in people who were willing to meet it on its own terms. We've come to the end of our trip through the dark and mysterious forests of Michigan, a story that makes us think that there are still places in the world where the strange whispers on the edges of the everyday, where questions remain unanswered and mystery holds its sacred ground. If you made it to the end of this story, please leave a comment with your thoughts on it. If you want to see more trips like this, subscribe to the channel. Until our next meeting with the unknown.